Perfect. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate being here again for the second time chatting about cosmic horrors havoc on the body electric. So I wanted to give a brief overview about what we'll be discussing today. So we are going to be discussing cosmic horror and its effects on the body and the mind. So we'll be delving into chilling depths of this unique subgenre through the haunting narratives of Victor LaValle's The Ballad of Black Tom, John Langan's The Fisherman, and Stephen King's Gray Matter. Now, these stories are each a marvel in their own right, but help to unravel the fabric of our reality and expose the terrifying forces that lurk just beyond the universe and the horrifying transformations that challenge our understanding of what humanity truly is. Excuse me. So we're going to delve into that. Cosmic horror really finds itself on parallel with a lot of themes of Gothic horror. So atmospheric dread, supernatural occurrences, the exploration of the descent into madness, isolation, human frailty, melancholy and despair, and tension and suspense. So let's start with the basics. What is it, and where did the inspiration for the genre of cosmic horror come from? So cosmic horror, eldritch horror, most often called Lovecraftian horror, emphasizes the horror of the unknowable and the incomprehensible. It has strong sci-fi elements as well as strong body horror elements. And if you're unfamiliar with body horror, pick up any David Cronenberg film and that will help to sort you out. This genre is named after H.P. Lovecraft, whose works most often included dread, dangerous knowledge, descent into madness, religion, and going further than a human should in scientific studies and magic. But we're not going to chat about Lovecraft all that much because of his notorious racism, and his monsters were often thinly veiled stand-ins for people of color. But as you can see, you can take influence and leave out the awful bits. So here's what our inspiration seems to be. So for me, I really feel that in the scientific advancements of the 19th and 20th century, the possibilities seemed endless with the help of contraptions to make our lives easier, ways for our bodies to go further and faster and withstand much more than we ever thought possible. Couple that with Einstein's theory of relativity, sweeping scientific and then public circles, our world became more expansive, as did our quest to find our place within it. With mentalism and philosophical movements of existentialism and nihilism, like Nietzsche declaring God is dead, it really brought about a dread of the unknown and the meaning of life. And with that, the indifference of the universe. The world keeps on turning no matter what happens to me or anyone else. You also have spiritualism coming around in this era. It's heaviest between 1830 and around 1915, where we suspected there was something beyond us, or a certain number of us could touch or be touched by the other side, therefore expanding our perceived reach. Blend that with all the disillusionment of a post-World War I era, racist advertisements, aggressions, and carrying those anxieties and the now unpredictability of life, of financial freedom, of political freedom, and powerlessness. And you'll see these themes play through all the stories we're going to touch on today. And I think the longevity of cosmic horror as a whole is really something to witness, because I can't think of a time where we didn't have more and more scientific advancement, or more schools of thought, or more psychics and astrologers, or more PTSD and more uncertainty and financial anxiety. Cosmic horror really shows us that as mighty as we think we are, we cannot control the universe or its plans. So some of the recent cinema that I've loved on the cosmic horror bend is Annihilation, Color Out of Space, which is an adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft, and In the Mouth of Madness, which is inspired by Lovecraftian monsters, and basically title is a play on The Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. So pulling that aside, getting into our first piece of The Ballad of Black Tom, and speaking in our further class that we had this morning, there were a few that were in the book club that have already read this novella, which I find absolutely captivating, and I'm so blessed to have read it. I really, really adore this spin on H.P. Lovecraft's The Horror at Red Hook. So in a quest to turn The Horror at Red Hook by Lovecraft on its head, fixing a protagonist of color in the 1920s versus the casual and overt racism of Red Hook's white protagonist, Detective Malone, author Victor LaValle penned The Ballad of Black Tom, about a small-time hustler, Tommy Tester, whose regular guise as a street musician brings him in contact with reclusive millionaire Robert Soydum, who wants him to participate in a nefarious scheme involving the Great Old Ones. Among the tools that Tester uses to thwart the scheme is the supreme alphabet of the 5% Nation. And Detective Malone plays a much more secondary character this time around. And I love this quote within the book: is this, "The world is a demon, hungrily lapping up the terror it spawned." And I want to start with this book as it closely related to the Lovecraftian work and its themes of unattainable knowledge and shady and dangerous otherworldly dealings, but in an atmosphere of racial tension and the occult. And there's no better place to start with this novella than the psychological transformation that takes place almost immediately within Tom Tester. As we begin the story, Tom is a hustler in Harlem, using his musical talents and his occult knowledge to make a living. His initial motivations are quite pragmatic, driven by the need to support himself and his father in the world that offers very limited opportunities for a Black man in the 1920s. From the beginning, Tom experiences the brutalities of racism and systemic oppression. These experiences contribute to a simmering anger and a sense of injustice, which lay the groundwork for his later transformation, which really begins to set in after he meets Soidem, an affluent Dutch man deeply involved in the occult. Soidem offers Tester a substantial amount of money for his services, pulling him deeper into the world of dark magic and ancient cosmic forces. Now, as Tester delves deeper into Soidem's world, he encounters these eldritch entities and ancient rituals that challenge his understanding of reality. And this exposure begins to change his perception of the world and his place in it, filling him with a sense of power, but also existential dread. And this forbidden knowledge begins to erode his sanity, as the truths he uncovers are terrifying and also really destabilizing for him. And these beings embody the cosmic horror element of the ancient godlike creatures and the existence of things beyond human understanding. And for someone like Tester, who's been othered, who has always been discounted, is finding himself in league with something much greater, and it becomes incredibly attractive for him. Tester's identity begins to shift as he embraces the dark powers he encounters, and he becomes Black Tom, a name that signifies his transformation into something other than his former self. And this new identity is more powerful, more vengeful, and willing to engage in the cosmic horrors that once terrified him. So already we have our pieces of dread. We have our need to harness the universe and make sense of otherworldly knowledge that we've got no business dealing with, because humans are stubborn. So I want to take a look at the physiological effects on Tom. And during this climatic ritual that happens at Soidem's mansion, because he's now been pulled further and further into Soidem's mission of contacting and harnessing this otherworldly power, Tom is exposed to the terrifying truths of the cosmos. And this ritual is intended to summon powerful cosmic entities and involves arcane chants and symbols. Tester's physical transformation is closely linked to this ritual, as it not only empowers him, but also physically alters him, making him an embodiment of the dark forces that he's now aligned with. The event is marked by chaos and violence, particularly as it intersects with a raid by Detective Malone and other police officers. And during the raid and that ensuing confrontation, Tom is shot multiple times by Detective Malone. The gunshot wounds are severe, and they physically mutilate him and cause him immense pain. But beyond the physical damage, Tom's transformation into Black Tom represents a symbolic mutilation. His identity and humanity are stripped away as he becomes an instrument of cosmic horror. The trauma of racial injustice and the brutality he endures, combined with the exposure to the eldritch forces, leave him physically scarred and mentally shattered. Post-mutilation, Tom embraces his new identity of Black Tom, and his physical scars were really only a testament to the violence and horror he has endured. But they also mark his rebirth into a vengeful and powerful being connected now to these cosmic entities. The mutilation serves as a catalyst for Tom's complete transformation into being driven by both empowerment and madness. And he uses his pain and newfound powers to exact revenge on those that have wronged him, particularly the racist systems and individuals who contributed to his suffering. This descent highlights the novella's themes of injustice and the fragility of the human psyche and human frailty, and the terrifying allure of forbidden knowledge. Now we've got our human frailty piece and the violence inflicted upon him. Just going through Tester's body breakdown, starting with the psychological piece. So with Soydam exposing him to Eldritch forces, Tom becomes more dependent on his new knowledge and dark power and more willing to engage with the dark forces that he once feared. And he craves more and more power and control as he goes on. And the physiological aspect, coupled with his emotional and mental trauma, Tom endures the physical trauma of being shot multiple times, and that maims him. And as the darkness of these forces of the great old ones take over him, his composition breaks down, disfiguring him into something horrific. The physical brutality he endures and the subsequent mutilation of his body exemplify more of that body horror aspect that cosmic horror does so well, and the devastating impact that cosmic forces have on human flesh. And this novella is really so incredible, and I've really only touched on a third of it because I don't want to ruin too much of the really beautiful parts of lore and Tom's encounter with many forces, but it's the existential dread of cosmic horror and the brutal realities of racial oppression, which create a really strong narrative for finding something in your life that you can finally control. And in that control, be able to seek out and act out retribution and revenge on those that have wronged you. So it's both unsettling and resonant because it shows the roads that trauma can lead you down and what we wouldn't give for a little bit of power, right? And we need to be able to drag ourselves out of that. And the cost of this mutilation really serves as a catalyst for Tom's complete transformation into being driven by both empowerment and madness. So I really love this. If you have a chance to pick this up, it's The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle. It's a novella, so it's a quite quick read, less than 200 pages, I believe, but it's so beautiful in the way that it really flips the conversation of two-dimensional, really overtly racist characters in the horror of Red Hook by Lovecraft into really putting a person of color at the center of this story, knowing that he has all this enormous amount of baggage of racial oppression and injustice, trying to get by, being penniless, struggling behind him before he even meets Soydam. So he has so much more to gain in his mind with getting that control and harnessing those forces. So we're going to move on a little bit to something a little more of a quick read, but also a little more of the human piece and another struggle that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to move on to Stephen King's Gray Matter. And none of us is a stranger to Stephen King. His work has really permeated our culture. Quotes like, "Here's Johnny" from The Shining, "They're all going to laugh at you" from Carrie. We've stolen vernacular and resonance from his stories and his film adaptations. But I love this story of Gray Matter because, like I said, number one, it's a quick read. I do love, truth be told, I do love King's story collections more than his novels. I think that they give a little bit more richness, and a little bit more of get in, get out. King is very blessed with legato writing. So I do love the fact that he can make things a little bit more compact. And this one is an absolute winner on the cosmic piece, but also touching on a lot of pieces of humanity and struggle. So this one is from his short story collection called Night Shift, which also birthed Salem's Lot and the Children of the Corn adaptations. And it's a cosmic horror set in a small Maine town. Of course, where else would it be? We're talking about Stephen King. And we're going to look at Gray Matter. And I love this quote from Gray Matter. It says, "But I'm saying that there are things in the corners of the world that would drive a man insane to look him right in the face." And that is a really beautiful explanation for the feelings of the characters within this film. And this, not this film, excuse me, this book. And then also it was adapted into a Creep Show episode. So you can watch this visually. I believe it was season 1 of the reboot, which is, it does a beautiful job laying this story out. So beginning in a heavy snowstorm in Bangor, Maine, an older man and his friends are at a convenience store when a terrified boy runs in. They recognize him as Richie Grenadine's son, and Richie, who used to work in was injured in a work accident and is now receiving lifetime compensation, became a recluse. And he's rarely seen outside except to buy the cheapest beer, which is a task he now sends his son to do. So a little bit on Richie's piece. Really want to talk about the psychological transformation of Richie, who now chooses to be a recluse. He stays inside. He's withdrawing from the world. And I think that that's really true of anyone in this particular situation. So the psychological transformation of Richie is not uncommon. Statistics show that 23% of the world's population fall into a deep depression after any serious accident or injury has left them immobile or needing assistance. And so the reclusiveness really tracks here. As his condition worsens, though, Richie becomes more increasingly paranoid and isolated. He locks himself in his apartment, he avoids contact with others, and his mental state deteriorates alongside his physical condition, showing the psychological toll of this transformation. Now, the gang at the store, after speaking privately with Richie's son, the narrator, who is our reliable narrator in this story, and the store owner, Henry, decide to take the beer to Richie himself. On the way, Henry recounts the boy's terrifying stories. One day, Richie drank a bad beer, quote unquote, implied to carry a mutagen, and begins to transform into a blob-like abomination that detests light and craves warm beer. The boy spied on his father one night and saw him eat a dead cat, prompting him to seek help. Now, eating dead cats doesn't usually track with reclusiveness, but Richie's transformation begins when he consumes a tainted can of beer. And this beer contains a strange unknown substance that triggers his metamorphosis. What's really interesting about this can of beer is the cause of the infection is never really fully explained. And it adds to the layer of cosmic horror by implying the presence of some unknown, some malevolent force that has invaded this beer, which could be any beer in all of Maine. Richie's humanity erodes as he succumbs to this infection. His thoughts and his actions become more erratic, and he is detached from his former self, illustrating the psychological horror of losing one's identity and his sanity. And what we can see here is that something has grossly changed in the boy's relationship to his father and his life in that household. A household where his injured father does nothing but drink. And what King is really providing us here is a cosmic horror metaphor for the stages of acute alcoholism. And where Tom Tester arrived with years of societal oppression and trauma, Richie Grenadine pushes that psychological piece aside and rushes headlong into physiological change. And this next slide you're looking at is the adaptation of gray matter for Creepshow. So Richie's son comes into the store. He's speaking with the locals. He's terrified. He's telling them the story about his father. And when the locals go to Richie's home, the second piece of this slide is what they encounter, which used to be Richie. He's covered in fungus. He's covered in mold. And they don't know what's happening to him. So after arriving at Richie's home, the men confront him behind the closed door, demanding that he come out. And the stench convinces Richie that he's eating more than dead cats, possibly responsible for the recent missing people that have been cropping up in the area. When Richie emerges, resembling more fungus than man, the men flee, except for Henry, who stands his ground and fires his pistol. And the narrator recalls glimpsing the creature dividing, which you can see in the third piece of our slide here. And he calculates its exponential growth. And as they wait and see whether Henry or the creature survived, they're all waiting in bated breath if he is going to overtake Henry, if he's split into more, if it's going to kill the population of this area. And it's really left there, which is such a ambiguous way to leave a horror story. And I absolutely love that. But I think we have some really incredible elements here. And I've shaved this story down quite a bit for brevity because it does elongate more into Richie's son's relationship with him leading up to that, folks' interactions with Richie before his transformation. But the story is really quite terrifying because it's those recurring themes that get me every time. And King's use of it here as that metaphor is really quite genius. And we've talked about the story being a metaphor for the insidiousness of alcoholism. But I want to first start off with having to face the limitations of our own body and seeking out something we can control. Changing our perspective with the assistance of an outside substance. Everybody has talked about, pre-gaming, drinking for liquid courage, having just a little bit to take the edge off. We're understanding that we can change our perception of our environment and our place within it if we can do that with an outside substance. And here's our melancholy and despair reflected that we touched on at the top of the hour. Richie has turned to alcohol to cope with the fact that he is no longer viable in the workforce to his own mind. And the story vividly depicts this horrifying physical transformation of Richie after he consumes this tainted can of beer. This transformation involves grotesque changes to his body, including the growth of gray fungus-like matter and this repulsive, slimy texture. And this degeneration illustrates the core of the body horror, like cosmic horror is so famous for, but also highlighting the fragility and the vulnerability of the human body, again, just like Tom, but in a different light. So if we're looking at the psychological aspect of Richie's body breakdown, he starts as an all but, somewhat unremarkable man. He's an, average Joe going to work every day. And after his injury, he spends his days drinking beer and gradually withdrawing from his responsibilities and social interactions. Physiologically, his transformation is not just a slow decay, but a rapid mutation that makes him more and more dangerous and alien. His son says he's been eating cats. They don't know what else he's been going after and eating. And his body becomes capable of rapid, unnatural growth and changes, emphasizing the unpredictability and horror of his condition, just like the unpredictability and horror of acute alcoholism. And the cost of that transformation, Richie Grenadine's transformation in this story encapsulates both body horror and cosmic horror, and his physical degeneration and the psychological toll it takes on him illustrate the body corruption, while the unexplained nature of his infection and the broader implication introduce a sense of dread and helplessness in that type of world. It's scary. We all lived through the pandemic. It was terrifying that there was something on a global expanse that we had no control of. And it was dreadful. Was this the end of the world? How were we going to survive this? It all felt very post-apocalyptic. So it's understandable that this story gains and builds upon that dread and that fear. And this transformation is not just a personal affliction, but it hints at a larger, more insidious spread. The potential to infect and consume is really quite terrifying in a cosmic horror sense. The otherworldly forces and how this potential for widespread infection really brings about an unstoppable and pervasive threat. And like I said, I really adore this story. It is quite a quick, I say quite a quick read for Stephen King, which, like I said, he gets quite legato in his writing pieces. But I think for this one, especially as a metaphor for hopelessness and, turning to something that quells that and mistakenly containing a mutagen and moving and stretching our body into different, something horrific because we needed to cope, which I think is just a really, really magic way to speak about that. And I'm so glad that we did. And we're going to move on to our final piece, which is The Fisherman by Jonathan Langan. And I love closing with this piece or speaking about this piece because it's one of the subgenres of horror that have my entire heart. It's grief horror. And the blend of grief horror and cosmic horror is done so masterfully in this book. And I will try to keep my spoilers at a minimum. There's a lot of lore in this book that I will touch on momentarily. But I do think that it is one of the most beautiful grief horror and cosmic horror reads I've read in the last decade. It's really one of the most amazing stories. And I love this quote for the fisherman. It says, "But there are some things, no matter if they're true, you can't live with them. You have to refuse them. You turn your eyes away from whatever's squatting right there in front of you and not only pretend it isn't there now, but that you never saw it in the first place. You do so because your soul is a frail thing that can't stand the blast furnace heat of revelation. And truth be damned, what else can a body do?" And that is a beautiful way to really talk about the adverse reactions both of these men have to their grief. So moving into this, even in that grief, this book is just as incredible cosmic and gothic themes that come into play. We've got melancholy, we have trauma, otherworldly forces, human frailty, the body horror, and that terror and suspense. And it's just a magical, magical book. So as we start off the story, Abe is a widower who struggles to find peace after his wife's death. After a bout of alcoholism, Abe uses fishing to find peace. Abe forms a friendship with his coworker, Dan, who recently survived a terrible accident that left him a widower as well. And after some weekends of fishing, Dan suggests the pair try out Dutchman's Creek, a mysterious fishing spot with a cursed past that's rumored to bring back lost loved ones. On their way to the creek, they stop at a diner and are warned of the dangers of Dutchman's Creek. And ignoring the warning, the two men continue on their way. At the creek, they come face to face with the mysterious Der Fischer, who is attempting to catch the primordial Leviathan. They are faced with the choice to help him and regain their lost loves or defy him and fight for survival. So we begin the story with Abraham, who takes to only wanting to be called Abe due to him not feeling that he is righteous enough to be addressed as the full name. And Abe meets a younger woman named Marie at work, and they fall deeply in love, and they're married. Months into their marriage, it's revealed that Marie has advanced cancer, and less than 2 years into their marriage, Marie is dead. In complete devastation, Abe tries to mask his grief, and to briefly escape, he picked up the hobby of fishing and frequently goes to places to fish like the Catskills and other places of beauty. We meet Abe's co-worker, Dan, who was involved in a deadly car accident where a truck crushed his car at an intersection, instantly killing his wife and twin sons. Thrown through the windshield, he survived only with a long scar on his face to remind him. Abe noted that while both men experienced loss, theirs were quite different. Abe had time to spend with his wife and settle affairs and say things he's never had the chance to say, whereas Dan lost his family in an instant. So fearing that he might provoke Dan's resentment, Abe hesitates to talk to him, feeling somewhat luckier in comparison. And a few months after the accident, Abe invites Dan to go fishing, which Dan accepts. And through that event, they remain mostly silent. However, Dan once confided in Abe that he copes with his grief by visiting the site of the accident and observing the new traffic light installed after the tragedy. So we have two different scopes of grief here. The psychological transformations of grief on these men are quite different. Abe carries his grief deeply, almost masking the fact that he's in pain, but in that grief reaches out for another person. So he reaches out to Dan, who has experienced loss as well, but not as similar. And Dan is overwhelmed by his grief and experiencing survivor's guilt. It's exacerbated by his willingness to sit at the new installed traffic light, which he feels that his family gave their lives for. And it's in a passage of the book where we really learn Dan's motivations. So Dan shares with Abe at the family's funeral that the priest claimed that they were in heaven and they were happy now. But Dan doubts this as there's no proof of heaven to him. He urgently wants to know what happens after death, if anything. And Dan suggests if God exists, it might be cruel, giving all the suffering in the world. He believes that humans might be unable to handle the harsh truth of reality, including the afterlife. And Abe thinks about this and reflects on the fragility of the human mind, noting that some truths are unbearable to accept, leading people to deny them to protect their souls from the harshness of revelation. And Abe is the one that says that quote at the top of our slide for the fishermen. But it's on Dan's insistence that they travel to Dutchman's Creek. And at this point, Abe isn't sure what his motivation is. And as they get caught on a storm heading towards it, almost foreboding storm, they stop at a diner where they tell a man named Howard where they're headed. And Howard is horrified and begins to regale them about the tale of Dutchman's Creek. Now, in this novel, it takes up a huge space of time. It's 50-50 Dutchman's Creek lore, and the other half Abe and Dan's story. But I will try to encapsulate this as best as I can for you. So the lore of Dutchman's Creek really plays heavily into how these men really further their grief and how the cosmic horror really takes hold of each of them separately. So for Dutchman's Creek's history, as New York City grew amongst the ashes of the Civil War, the outskirts into the Catskills housed a small settlement. And in that settlement was visited by a guest of mystery and housed by a man whose wife lay ill. 2 days after the guest arrived, the man's wife dies. And after the burial, the guest stays on and begins an odd friendship with the house owner. The villagers began to notice that the house owner now has a lady companion with him these days, dressed all in black and veiled and walking as if she's just received new legs. As all would have it, the guest was instrumental in bringing people back to life by using eldritch forces and attempting to harness the otherworldly power in a nearby creek. Understanding in those days that death visited more than luck, grief held tightly onto the hearts of those villagers, and he knew that using their energy, their grief as energy, he could only tame the otherworldly beast, but bring their loved ones back to life, no matter how rotted, how mangled, and how dark force laden they may now be. So now Dan is very, very interested in this theory, and at his behest, Abe reluctantly follows as the storm clears. So they're barring any warning they just received from Howard, who is given this 50% of the book lore. They're still wanting to see if there is an afterlife. They're still wanting to be reunited with their loved ones through that human piece of extreme grief. And Dan reveals that he's actually learned about Dutchman's Creek from his grandfather's fishing journal, where his grandfather wrote about seeing his late wife there, who had been dead for 8 years. Dan confesses his overwhelming guilt and sorrow over his family's deaths and suggests that Abe could also see his wife again if the creek is truly supernatural. At this, Dan disembarks from the boat and runs upstream, and Abe follows him only to run into Marie, his wife. Now, the physiological aspects of these men lie solely with their lost loved ones. They're more on a mental and psychological scar. So for Abe, running into Marie, his late wife, she's more worse for the wear. She's pallid, she's yellow, and she's soaking wet. And even still, Abe is in love with her. He is attracted to her deeply, and they proceed to do the sort of things that married couples love to partake in. And after this act, Abe realizes that Marie is actually a putrid, mangled sea creature and flees. So for Abe, that psychological body breakdown, carrying his grief really deeply. I mean, really masking the fact that he's in pain, and reaches out to Dan, who's experienced this loss, though not as similar. Even his encounter with Marie from the other world, he's overcome with love and arousal. So psychologically, he's still there with his wife. Physiological, drinking very heavily after his death and almost losing his job. That's as far as his physiological transformation goes outside of having a broken heart. And for him, the cost of the transformation, we come to when we encounter Dan again in this piece. So running into Dan, who is surrounded by his dead children and his wife, who are now razor-teethed and golden-eyed. He is transfixed on the man they call Der Fisher, who is in the throes of taming the Leviathan. So Dan knows both he and Abe, if they help him, if they lend their grief energy to him, they can have their loved ones back. And Abe does not want to give his energy. He does not agree with the way that Dan is behaving. He's not thinking through what could possibly happen after the fact, and this enrages Dan. And I cannot spoil this ending because it's so incredibly moving. And like I said, that grief piece is incredibly heavy start to finish within this book. But what's so moving, albeit surrounded by otherworldly terror, is that the quest to return the order of things while amid grief. And anyone who has lost someone in their lives wishes they could reverse that or have just one more moment or just one more day. And there's no justice in death for those left behind. And we really ask ourselves, what would we risk for that option? So really trying to understand Dan's perspective and his body breakdown. So psychologically, he spends most of his time at the intersection where he lost his family, staring at the new construction signal. He can't move on, and he wants them back by any means necessary. And physiologically, his transformation is his descent into madness, which obviously more psychological on that aspect, but it leaves him very quick-tempered. He's thinner. He's not thinking. And there is a time passage in this book that shows that he is definitely more worse for the wear when they left for Dutchman's Creek. And his cost of his transformation he fully believes that his family will come back and live on, and he can't see past the consequences of his actions. And for that, he really surely pays the price emotionally. And it's a terrific way to look at how people handle grief. People really go several forks into how they can handle it, whether it's denial, whether it's bargaining, whether it's, trying to find the reasons why. Dan is, a piece of all of us, and really trying to reconcile why this has happened to him, and really resorting to any type of otherworldly help in order to bring those people back. So we have, those themes. Cosmic horror cannot survive without playing into human themes. So we have the themes of melancholy, of trauma, of otherworldly forces, the human frailty, body horror, and we've also got all of those inspirations from the first place. For Dan, the world keeps on turning no matter what happens to me or anyone else. That ticks him off. He's mad that things keep going, and nobody seems to care that he's lost his family. This really touches on, is there another side? Can we reach those that we've lost before? Talking about the spiritualism era inspiration on cosmic horror? Can we reach the other side? And the anxieties of life turning upside down in an instant, that post-war anxiety, that anxiety of upheaval at any time. These are all those inspirations from cosmic horror that are still playing into modern cosmic horror. And like I said, cosmic horror can't survive without playing into human themes: atmospheric dread, supernatural occurrences, exploration and the descent into madness, isolation, human frailty, melancholy and despair, body horror, and horror of the unknowable and the incomprehensible. So it's really a story with, one of the main reasons I wanted to close this talk with it, because it encompasses all of those tense human themes and those inspirations that we were all going through in those turns of the centuries that inspired cosmic horror, with a human piece of grief. So hopefully, we enjoyed talking about this today. There's some book recommendations here that I have enjoyed myself, that couple with the really human pieces of cosmic horror, which is The Croning, Laird Barron, The King in Yellow, Robert W. Chambers, The Deep by Nick Cutter, The Worm and His Kings by Haley Piper, The Hollow Places, T. King Fisher, Night Bitch, which is just adapted into a film starring Amy Adams, by Rachel Yoder, House of Furies by Madeline Rue, Starbaker, again, just adapted into a film with Matt Smith and Morfydd Clark, by Andrew Michael Hurley, and Ripe by Sarah Rose Etter. So I hope you enjoyed this peek into the themes of cosmic horror and its effects on the body and mind in story. And I hope it's inspired you to seek out these themes in these books. And, hopefully you'll get more into cosmic horror films, cosmic horror cinema, and, read some new and old authors from those eras. But thank you for joining me today. So you can catch me. I'm on X most of the time, the artist formerly known as Twitter. I am there at Mo Moshaty, Momoshaty. So thank you so much for joining me today. And